Welcome to a special edition of Spicer & Company as we remember the terror attacks that occurred on September 11th, 2001. Good Friday evening. I'm Sean Spicer.
And I'm Lindsay Keith.
You know, this day 20 years ago, September 10th, 2001, was the last day America would ever be the same. The series of coordinated terror attacks on our nation changed everyone's lives forever. From the 2,977 innocent lives lost, to the heroes that responded to the attacks, to the family members who lost loved ones, and to those who went forward to fight the terrorist.
And tonight on Spicer & Company, we're going to hear from some of the most inspiring stories that came from one of America's darkest days, with former Commissioner of New York City Police Department Bernie Kerik and the former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, along with former Chief of Staff for George W. Bush Andy Card.
Yeah, before we get to that, let's take a listen to the message of hope that then President George W. Bush gave that became a rallying point for our grieving nation.
I'm a loving guy, and I'm also someone, however, who's got a job to do, and I intend to do it. This is a terrible moment, but this country will not relent until we have saved ourselves and others from the terrible tragedy.
I think everyone watching the show right now probably remembers where they were on September 11th. It's a heartbreaking and difficult day that is probably etched into everybody's mind. Our next guest was next to the leader of the free world when our nation was under attack that day and actually had to deliver the information that our nation was under attack. Take a look at this.
Yes, playing. Get ready. Must. Yes, must. Go to your speaker, reader up from under your seat. Open your book up to lesson 60 on page 153.
All right, let's bring that man in, the former White House Chief of Staff for George W. Bush, Andy Card. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us.
Sean, it's a joy to be with you. Thank you for having me.
So that moment that we just saw on video, you whispering in President Bush's ear, walk me through, when did you decide that you needed to interrupt the president, and what did you know at that time?
Well, just before the president was to go into the classroom with the second graders at the Emma E. Booker School in Sarasota, Florida, he was told by the acting national security advisor on the trip, a Navy captain by the name of Deb Lauer, it appears a small twin-engine prop plane crashed into one of the towers at the World Trade Center in New York City. The principal, the president, and I were standing together. We all had the same reaction. Oh, what a horrible accident. The pilot must have had a heart attack or something. And then the president was escorted into the room by the principal. She opened the door, and she and the president walked into the classroom. The door shut, and Captain Lauer came up to me and said it was not a small twin-engine prop plane. It was a commercial jetliner. My mind flashed to the fear that the passengers on the plane must have had. They had to know it wasn't gaining altitude. I don't know why that's where my mind went, but it did. But then a nanosecond later, Captain Lauer came up to me and said, oh, my God, another plane hit the other tower at the World Trade Center. And it was very traumatic. I performed a test that chiefs of staff have to perform all the time. Does the president need to know? Yes, this was an easy test to pass. I made a decision to pass on 2 facts and 1 editorial comment. I opened the door to the classroom and walked in, and Ann Compton from ABC News saw me, and it was unusual for me to come into the room. I waited. The students were conducting a dialogue with the president. I didn't want to interrupt that. The teacher said to the students, take out your books. I used that as the time to go up and talk to the president. I leaned over into his right ear and I said, a second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack. And that's what I said to him. I was pleased with how he reacted. He didn't do anything to introduce fear to those young second graders. He did nothing to demonstrate fear to the media that it would have translated it to the satisfaction of the terrorists all around the world. But that's what happened, and I'm convinced that day he reflected on his job, which is the President of the United States. I actually say I think it's when he realized what the job of the president is. It's to keep your oath, preserve, protect, and defend. And that's what he did. And That's the story of me whispering in his ear. I didn't want to have a conversation with him because I presumed that everybody, the media, would have picked it up. I presumed there was a boom microphone nearby. So I didn't want him to have a conversation with me. And that was a controversial decision. I just whispered into his ear, stepped back. He did not turn around. He did not get up. Again, I was pleased with how he did react. It also gave me a chance to get back into the holding room and get things ready for him. The first thing I said was get the FBI director on the phone, get a line open to the vice president, get a line open to the White House Situation Room, get the crew back on Air Force One. And to the Secret Service, I said, turn the motorcade around. And to Dan Bartlett, the communications director on the trip, I said, get some remarks written for the people in the gymnasium. The president will have to talk to them, but he can't say anything we do not know to be the truth. And then the president walked into the holding room. Everybody glom-domed to him. And the first thing he said was get the FBI director on the phone. It was Bob Mueller. He'd only been the FBI director for 10 days.
Wow. And Mr. Secretary, after that, President Bush was adamant about getting back to Washington, D.C., but intelligence didn't think that it was safe to move at that time. You were also insistent that the president should go back to Washington. Why was that?
Well, the president really wanted to go back to Washington, D.C. Mark Tillman, the captain of Air Force One, did not want to land at Andrews Air Force Base without knowing that the plane would be safe. And the Secret Service was very uncomfortable going back to Washington, D.C. There was some fear that there could be another attack. We did not know what was going on the ground. And so the Secret Service and the pilot of Air Force One were adamant that we should not go back there. The president was adamant that we should go. He kept telling me, we're going back to Washington, D.C. I said, I don't think you want to make that decision right now, Mr. President. I understand you want to get there, but I think we should wait and see. And he kept getting more and more angry with me. And I actually wrestled with a tough question. Was he saying that as President of the United States, or was he saying that as Commander-in-Chief, meeting national security responsibilities? And I said to myself, he wants to go back to Washington, D.C., kind of as the political leader of the country, but I think he has all the tools he has needs at his hands right now to do his job as Commander-in-Chief and protect us. So he was pretty angry with me. We ended up going back to Washington, D.C. after stops in Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, and then at the Strategic Air Command in Omaha, Nebraska. And we did get back to Washington, D.C. You know that he addressed the American people and the world from the Oval Office at 8:30 at that night from Washington, D.C. And then he went right into a meeting in the bunker underneath the White House with his national security team.
You know, Mr. Secretary, in reading up on this, it seems like there was a lot of technological and communication failures. We're looking at Air Force One flying around. I saw that you guys, were going from local media market to local media market as you went over. There was one instance that President Bush couldn't get in touch with President Cheney. The line kept going long. What did that say to you as the White House Chief of Staff about our level of preparedness at that time?
Well, we certainly learned something. We had remarkable communications on Air Force One, but it did not live up to the expectations that we had or the needs that we had. But we did restrict all other phone calls from going out of Air Force One. So the lines were dedicated for use by the president and the pilot. So we did not, other people had to get permission to make calls back. For example, Mike Morrell with the CIA did call back to the CIA director. But we were very careful not to overload the systems that were in Air Force One. Obviously, after the attacks, and we learned our lessons, the communications have been upgraded significantly. But when the president got on the ground at Strategic Air Command in Omaha, Nebraska, we had outstanding communication, and really, you could hear the fog of war. You could hear all of the communication with the FAA and the military, and you kind of knew what was going on. And the president had a very successful video conference from the SATCOM base, and it went well. And he turned to me and he said, can we go back to Washington, D.C. right now? And I went out and checked with the Secret Service, and they were still a little bit reluctant, but acquiesced. And then the pilot said that he was confident that he could land at Andrews Air Force Base. We had fighter jets accompany us the whole trip from Sarasota to Barksdale, and then on to Omaha, Nebraska, and then back to Washington, D.C., Andrews Air Force Base. And I remember as we were coming into land, the pilots were so close to Air Force One as we were coming into land at the Joint Base Andrews, you could actually see the faces of the pilots in the plane. So it was, and you saw the smoke billowing out of the Pentagon, and that's when the president looked over to me and he said, that's the face of war in the 21st century. So it was pretty remarkable.
Secretary Card, please stay with us. We want to continue this conversation right after the break.
Well, former White House Chief of Staff Andy Card is back with us as we commemorate the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and those terrible terror attacks. Mr. Secretary, welcome back.
Thank you very much. Please,
So
we're pleading for everyone to keep their promise never to forget what happened that day.
Well, yes.
Yes, and I want to talk to you about that because we always say that. We've always said that as we commemorate 9/11, never forget. But 20 years later, are we holding true to that pledge?
Well, I don't view it as a commemoration. I view it as a memorial. We don't want to forget that there were almost 3,000 people who died that day, and well over 3,000 if you count the people who died as a result of that day. Some people were EMTs that got sick and died, had a shorter lifespan than they would have otherwise. Other people joined the military and made sacrifices. So we should really remember that day and pay tribute to all of those who died that were completely innocent, all of those who responded to the call to duty as EMTs and firefighters and policemen and made unbelievable sacrifices with their life. And then those who answered the call to duty and joined the military, the intelligence services, and as EMTs and policemen and firemen around the world. So there's a lot for us to remember. The most memorable day I had working for 3 presidents was September 14th, 2001. And that's when the president told the world they would hear us after someone said, I can't hear you, I can't hear you. And it's also a day that he prayed for a nation and prayed for the world. It was a day that he rallied the rescue workers as they were rescuing people and trying to find people who could still be alive down at ground zero. But he also comforted the victims, and he met with many victims or parents and mothers and fathers and spouses, and he didn't expect to do it that day. He was actually, the advance team had set up a podium. He told him he could go in and make some remarks. He didn't want to do that. Instead, he went in and he literally went to every single person in the room, stayed there almost 2 hours, listening to the expectations they had that their husband was professional and he'd be okay, the fear that they thought that he wouldn't, the hope, the prayers, the tears. It was just remarkable. But he was then, as he was getting ready to leave that room, Arlene Howard, who was the first person he saw when he walked into the room, stood up and looked at the president, and she was a short, stocky woman, and she said, "This is my son's badge." As she held out her hand with the badge in it, and she said, "His name is George Howard. Don't ever forget him." And the president, with tears streaming down his cheeks, opened his hand, and she dropped the badge into the president's hand. He squeezed it. And I'll never forget what he said to Mrs. Howard. He said, "Mrs. Howard, America will forget. They'll move on, but you don't have to worry about me. I will never forget George Howard." And then with tears streaming down his cheeks, and I was crying, everybody was crying, we went out and got in the limousine and to go down to the Marine One where it was down by the I'm going to say the Wall Street landing zone. And I remember the president reached in his pocket and pulled out that badge. He opened his hand and he looked at the badge. It was badge number 1012. And then he squeezed it, shut his eyes. I honestly believe he was praying. He never said a word. Then he opened his eyes and he just put the badge in his pocket and carried it with him for the rest of his presidency. So we have an obligation never to forget. And those of us who are old enough to remember it should make sure that those people who weren't around to remember it know about it so that they will keep the, I'm going to say, the faith in America and the resolve that America had. You know, again, September 11th, 2001 was a day when we overcame the divisions in America and came together as a nation. And that helped bring the world together to fight terror. And we want to give tribute to all those men and women who served in Afghanistan in particular, because they met the mission the president gave them. They protected America for the next 20 years. We haven't had an attack emanating from Afghanistan. So thank you to all those who served in Afghanistan, especially those who served and gave the ultimate sacrifice on our behalf.
It's so obvious listening to you how impactful that day was on you in particular. And so when you talk to somebody who wasn't born on 9/11, so many of these young people that we're sending off to war still, what do you tell them about the profound effect that that day had on you as a person?
Well, first of all, I say the images that day for some people look like a movie. It just surreal. And I'm haunted by many of the images of that day, the planes striking the World Trade Center, the planes striking the Pentagon, the heroes on Flight 93, who were the first heroes in the war on terror, that were all civilians, and they rushed the pilot and crashed that plane into Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Otherwise, it probably would have gone into the U.S. Capitol and killed countless numbers of people. So it haunts me that day. And to see when the buildings started to collapse and people were jumping out of the windows of the World Trade Center, I knew people on every plane that died. I knew people in every venue that died. The 2 World Trade Center towers, the Pentagon, and obviously people on Flight 93 that crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. So yes, this is a day that I will never forget. And I want people to really understand the magnitude of the attack, the sacrifices that were given by heroes who were civilians, and then all of those who responded to do the job and ran toward the disaster to try to mitigate the problem and solve it. And then all of those that raised their hand and took an oath to follow the commander or the commander-in-chief to help protect this great nation. And every president subsequent to 9/11 has maintained that honor. And we do pay tribute to those who answered the call to duty and helped protect this country. Only 1% of the people in this country serve in the military. It's a pretty remarkable 1% that do their job.
Secretary Card, thank you for sharing these stories with us tonight so that we don't ever forget what happened, but also thank you for your service. I think that God sometimes puts the right people in the right places at the right time, and there was a reason that you were White House Chief of Staff then, to guide our president at that time. So on behalf of a grateful nation, thank you for your service to our nation.
And, you know, remarkable people work at the White House and in government. Sean, thank you for your service. And everybody who is working in the White House or in the executive branch of government deserves to have a pat on the back. It's a tough job. They do well. And I want to celebrate what it means to be part of our great democracy, especially for those who decide to work for the U.S. government or take the oath of office to serve in our military or intelligence services. So thank you very much.
You bet. All right. We'll give you 2 pats, though. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Hey, I'm Rob Finnerty. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please join the conversation in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, too. Hit the bell icon to be alerted to breaking news. And remember, there's a whole lot more on Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news network. Newsmax TV, where real news for real people.